What I'd like to do today is to take a look at one of the kinot, one of the lamentations that we recite as part of the morning prayers of Tish'a BeAb. It is, for me, the most moving and poignant of all of the lamentations. That's just my opinion. That's not a fact. Each of the lamentations speaks to people very differently. But this one has a particular message that I think resonates with me that I feel is very important to explore on the day of Tish'a BeAb. You could see on the screen that I shared with you from the Teba publications of the keynote of Tish'a BeAb. A shout out and a thank you to Teba publications for putting this together. The kina known as Esh Tukad Bekirbi, a fire burns from inside of me, but is more commonly known as Betzeti Mimitzrayim and Betzeti Mirushalayim. The lamentation which speaks about the exodus from Egypt and the exodus from Yerushalayim, from Jerusalem. And this lamentation is really about contrast. It's really about comparing the glory and pride and greatness of the miracles that we had when we left Eretz Mitzrayim, our land of bondage and oppression, on our way to the land of Eretz Israel, in comparison with the tragedy, the despair, the grief and devastation that we experienced in our exile from the city of Yerushalayim, as told to us by Yirmiyahu in his book of Lamentations in Echa, and by many of the prophets as well. What I want to just take a look with you for a moment, a little bit of the poetry and why I think the poetry is so beautiful and so poignant here in this lamentation. So you'll notice that each stanza of the lamentation of the Kina has a verse, a line, I should say, which then ends with Betzeti Mimitzrayim, when I left Egypt, and then a line then which concludes with Betzeti Mirushalayim, when I left Jerusalem. And the lines having to do with when we left Mitzrayim are about our glory, about the miracles, and the lines having to do with our exodus from Jerusalem are about the grief and devastation that we experienced. Just to take a look at a few of them, just to get a flavor of it. For example, Dagan Mishamayim Vetzur, from heaven, and a rock which flowed with water when we left Mitzrayim, right? When we left Egypt and we wandered in the desert, HaKadosh Baruch Hu provided for us with all of our needs, food and water, in miraculous ways, giving us bread from Shamayim with the man, and then the rock from which water flowed forth for the Jewish people to be able to drink from. And to contrast that with what it is that we ate on our way out of Yerushalayim. So on our way out of Egypt, we ate bread from heaven and miraculous water. And then from when we left Yerushalayim, we have la'ana v'tamrurim, but wormwood and gall, umayim hamarim, and bitter waters, betzeti Yerushalayim, when we left from Egypt. So unlike the greatness of when we left from Jerusalem, unlike the greatness from when we left Egypt, eating the food from God, we now eat the bitter waters and the disgusting food of other human beings when we leave Yerushalayim. And this continues on and on throughout the poem that talks about Betzeti Mitzrayim and Betzeti Yerushalayim. You can see, I'll do maybe one more if you want to take a look. This is a nice one. I like it a lot because it shows the poet's usage of similar imagery, but contrasting them kind of together. So take a look at the one that starts, Tovu Ohalim, good tents, La'arba'ad Degalim, for 4 flags, Betzeti Mitzrayim, when we left from Egypt. When we left Egypt, Bil'am famously said the words, Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov Mishkenotecha Yisrael. How great are your tents of Jacob. He looked at the camp of the Jewish people as a holy camp, as a place where God's sanctity resided within the 4 camps that comprised the major camp of the Jewish people. It was a glorious sight to see the Jewish people camped together in unison in their own terms, surrounding their Mishkan with the divine presence in their midst. In stark contrast to that, the poet says, Aholei Yishme'elim, when we left Jerusalem, it was the tents of Yishme'elim, of foreigners, Ubahanot HaZarim, and the camps of strangers who encircled us, Betzeti Mirushalayim, when we left Jerusalem. It was no longer our camp. It was no longer our city. It was no longer under our pretenses. But instead, those beautiful tents that we had of the Jewish people leaving Egypt are replaced with the devastation and tragic tents of the Ishmaelim, of the foreigners and the Goyim who took control over us. And this continues throughout the entire poem. And it's important to look at the contrast in a very deep way. What's very interesting from a technical aspect, if you take a look for one moment, and for anybody who appreciates poetry for a minute, you'll notice that the poem is actually written as an acrostic in an aleph bet form. So take a look at the very first, the first stanza, Az Yashir Moshe, the aleph, we know that phrase, Az Yashir Moshe, and then Moshe sang when they crossed the sea, Shir Lo Yinashe, a song that will never be forgotten, Betzeti Mi Mitzrayim, when we left Egypt, Moshe Rabbeinu sang. So you have the aleph, which starts out the poem. In the second stanza, Beti Hitkonan V'Shachan He'anan, my house was established and the cloud dwelled upon us, the clouds of glory of God, Betzeti Mi Mitzrayim. And so on and so forth. If you go down the paragraphs, you'll notice that they go in aleph bet order, always for the line having to do with when we left Egypt, Betzeti Mi Mitzrayim. Never do we find an aleph bet acrostic structure for the line having to do with the exodus from Yerushalayim. And there's a reason why the poet does that. The exodus from Egypt makes sense. It's glorious. It's structured, it's orderly, it's how we want it. And hence, when describing the exodus from Egypt, the poet puts it in aleph bet order. Everything makes sense, everything is clear, everything is organized, and the world as we know it is our oyster. And that makes sense to us, that's the way we want it. And so it goes in aleph bet order. Whereas the second line of every stanza, which describes the tragic exodus from Jerusalem, is never in an acrostic order. It's never in aleph bet. That illustrates to us chaos, turmoil, strife, grief, which is never organized, which is never in one head, which is never in one mode. And so we feel the pain and the suffering of the poet every time he turns his attention to the exodus from Egypt. There's structure, things make sense, there's clarity. The moment he turns to describing the exodus from Jerusalem, there's chaos, there's turmoil, his mind is drifting. There's no way to clearly organize his thoughts in an aleph bet structure. That's one structural thing that I think is worth pointing out about this lamentation. A second thing is that the poet always contrasts similar ideas. So we'll go back again to the very first stanza, Az Yashir Moshe, the song that Moshe sang of triumph when the Jewish people crossed the sea, the Yam Suf, their glorious victory over the most powerful civilization of the time, the people of Egypt. And that gets contrasted with Vaikonen Yirmiyah, Yirmiyah's lamentation, which is also a song of sorts, right? Yirmiyah lamenting is also a song. It's just a very sad song. So the poet is contrasting the song of Moshe with the song of Yirmiyah. One, a song of happiness and joy. The other, a song of tragedy and sadness. We go back to the stanza that we saw before about the tents of the Jewish people versus the tents of the Ishmaelim, and we see that same contrast. The water that they drank from the rock when it flowed forth versus the bitter waters that they had when they left from Yerushalayim. One last one here on the bottom, Moshe Yir'eni. Moshe was leading the Jewish people with their heads held high as they left. Aharon Yanheni, and Aharon was leading them also as a shepherd. Betzeti mi Mitzrayim, when we left Egypt. Unevuchadnezzar, but when we left Egypt, it was not on when we left Jerusalem, I should say, it was not on our own volition. It was being taken prisoners and captives by Nebuchadnezzar and Adrianos Kesar, from Nebuchadnezzar and Hadrian, evil oppressors who tortured and tormented the Jewish people. And so you see that the poet often contrasted similar ideas that presented the glory of the exodus from Egypt in contrast with the devastation and tragedy of the exodus from Yerushalayim. There's one question, though, that every time I read this lamentation always bothers me. And the question is, why mention the great things that happened to us when we left Egypt? What's the point of that? To me, it's just adding salt on an open wound. Here we are, sitting on the floor, fasting, doing all sorts of morning practices. We're not bathing, we're not showering for the last week. We have not eaten meat. We have controlled what we do. We don't listen to music. We've been experiencing mourning and sadness in these practices for 3 weeks now, and it's gut-wrenching, and it's difficult, and we're commemorating the sadness. It just seems to me to all of a sudden start talking about the glory days of Egypt is just to add salt into an open wound. It just makes us feel even more inadequate, even more devastated that we cannot go back to those days, and we have trouble contextualizing them. So why mention them? And to me, this lamentation is unique from any of the other lamentations that we read throughout the day of Tish'a BeAb, because all of them only speak about the tragedy. None of them speak about our past glory. And here, this lamentation seems to hit to the core of what we used to have, what we had as a people when we left Mitzrayim. And why would we want to mention that? If anything, it's pretty ironic. It's pretty ironic that leaving Egypt, one of the worst places on earth for the Jewish people, a place of oppression, of death, of infanticide, of horrible tragedies, of slavery for 210 years, of tum'ah. The Torah constantly reminds us to not do the things that the Egyptians did. And yet leaving Egypt is such a glorious thought for us that we put it into this lamentation. And the irony is that our glory of leaving Egypt is what we want, more so than when we left our own city, Yerushalayim. It was in exile and it was in torment and in chaos. So again, my deep question is, why? Why should we mention the glory days of the Exodus from Egypt on this day? Is it just to make us feel even worse, even more inadequate, even suffering even more? Is that the point? To me, it seems to be unnecessary. Or is there something deeper that the poet is trying to illustrate here by hearkening back to all of the great things that happened to us when we left Egypt? To help answer that question, I'd like to turn our attention to one very interesting Gemara. A Gemara in Masechet Ketubot, Daf Samech Vav Amud Bet. We'll study this Gemara together, and I think we'll see a very, very poignant message that I think is being brought out in the poet who composed, I should say, the lamentation of Betseti Mitzrayim, Betseti Yerushalayim. I'll read the Gemara very quickly. Tanura Banan, the rabbis taught in the Beraita. This is a story about the destruction of the second Bet HaMikdash. Ma'aseh Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. A story was told about the great leader of the Jewish people at the time of the second Bet HaMikdash's destruction, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. I'm sure that's a name that has been heard throughout the day, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. He was riding on a donkey and exiting the city of Yerushalayim. And his students were walking and escorting him. And he saw a terrible sight. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai runs into a young maiden, a young woman, who is picking out barley kernels from the feces of animals which were not digested. She was picking these out because she was so hungry after the siege of the Jewish people that she was willing to eat in such a disgusting manner. This is what the Jewish people were reduced to. When she saw Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai coming, she wrapped her hair in a sense of modesty, and stood in front of the great rabbi. Amralo, and she said to him, Rabbi, my master, my rabbi, parneseni, please give me something to eat, sustain me. Amarla, he said to her, Biti mi'at, my daughter, who are you? Tell me what your name is. Amralo, she said, Bat Naktimon ben Gurion ani. I am the daughter of the famed Naktimon ben Gurion. To give a little context, Naktimon ben Gurion was one of the most wealthy people in the city of Yerushalayim just before the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash. He was on par with Kalba Savua, the father-in-law of Rabbi Akiva, these were known as the giants in terms of wealth of the city of Yerushalayim. And this was his daughter, relegated to picking out food from the feces of animals. And this really struck a chord with Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Amarla, he said to her, Biti, my daughter, Mamon shel bet avicha hechan halach. What happened to all the money of your father's home? Amralo, she said to him, Rabbi, lo kaden matnin mitla b'Yerushalayim, melach mamon haser. So she said to him that it wasn't my teacher. It is not that they say such a proverb in Jerusalem. Salt for money is lacking. There's nothing with which to preserve it and prevent it from being lost. In other words, she said, the money went where the money went, and the money of your father says, where did it go? She said, this one came and destroyed, that one came. Whatever happened to it, happened to it. That's sort of what she's illustrating to him. It's no way it just sort of disappeared overnight. Let's skip down a little bit. She says, Amra lo, and she says to him, Rabbi, Zechor ata kishehatamta et kitubati. She nostalgically says to Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, do you remember when you signed on my ketubah, when you signed my marriage contract? Amar lahen, and he said to them, the Talmidav, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai turned to his students and said, Zechor ani, I remember, kishehatamti al ketubata shel zo, when I signed the marriage license of this woman to get married, I proclaimed thousands upon thousands of gold coins mibet aviha from her father's house. Chutz mishel hamiha, more than aside from what she was getting from her father-in-law's house. Bachar Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and as a result of this, Rabban Yochanan Zakkai burst into tears. But look at what he says. He says something, and this is really the heart of this Gemara. Ve'amar, he says, Ashrechem Yisrael, praiseworthy are you, the Jewish people. Bizman she'osim retzono shel makom, when you perform the will of your Creator. En kol umah ve'lashon sholetet bahem, no nation or tongue can conquer you. Ubizman she'en osim retzono shel makom, but when you don't do the will of God, mosran biyad umah shfana, God puts you into the hands of the lowliest of people on earth. Velo biyad umah shfana, and not only in the hands of the lowliest people, ela biyad behentan shel umah shfana, into the hands of the animals of the lowest of people. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, after seeing this, exclaimed that looking at this woman picking the feces, the barley out of the feces of an animal, he said, how fortunate are the Jewish people that when we do the will of God, nothing stands in our way. Nobody can conquer us. But when we don't, we are relegated to the depths of tragedy, of disgustingness, and of lowliness. This is a very strange thing for Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai to say when seeing this. I think most of us would have seen this and just cried and wept and felt devastated and depressed. And Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and this is perhaps the secret to why he was such a good leader in the time of destruction, was able to revive the Jewish people and keep them going, was because he looked at the devastation in a positive angle. He actually stared at this disgusting display, this saddest of experiences, and said, this shows me how great the Jewish people are. We can go to such depths, we can experience such lows, but that's because we also have the ability to experience the greatest of highs. And that's our potential as a people. That's actually what is more organized and more appropriate for us as a people. In other words, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said the Jewish people don't hang in the middle. We're either in the highest of highs or we're at the lowest of lows. And right now we experience the lowest of lows. Tish'a BeAb, there is no lower point on our calendar. And what we go through as a people throughout the world, anti-Semitism and the tragedies and the difficulties that we see permeating the world, this is the lowest of lows. But at the same time, we have to take a Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai approach to it. We have to see the lowest of lows through the prism and the lens of what could be in the highest of highs. That Betseti Mirushalayim, that yes, as low as we were when we left Yerushalayim, think about how great things were when we left Mitzrayim, when we left Egypt upon miracles. We can restore those days. Hadesh Amenu Kikedim. We can bring those days back. And all it takes, and I say all it takes, but it takes a lot, but it takes following Hashem's will. Retzono Shel Makom. Following Torah, following mitzvot, being observant in halakha, taking care of our fellow man, bringing justice and righteousness to our communities and to our homes and into our individual lives, has the ability to restore the Jewish people to the highest of highs. And our fortunes can really change on a dime. Very briefly, because we are short on time, we won't read the psukim, but this is what Hannah, one of our foremothers, our great Hannah, who gave birth to Shemuel after being barren for so long, this is what she expresses in her tefillah after God finally grants her request of having a child. She, instead of saying thank you to God, which of course there is a certain level of gratitude, she speaks to the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu can change a person's fortunes at the drop of a hat. She says, Keshet giborim hatim v'nechshalim aziru hai. In verse 4, The bows of the mighty are broken, and the faltering of girded with strength. Sive'im ba'lechem niskaru. Men who were satiated must hire out for bread. U're'ivim hadelu. The people who are hungry no more. Ada akaraya shiva. While a barren woman bears 7, the mother of many is forlorn. In other words, Hannah, who experienced a change of her fortune, she was barren for so long and could not have a child. All of a sudden, things completely turn around for her at the drop of a hat. And for the opposite can happen as well. People who are doing really well, all of a sudden things can change on a dime. It's worth noting that certainly the last 3 to 4 months has taught us that lesson very, very much in many different ways. And we've experienced this, how people who were doing great financially, all of a sudden on a day, things were turned on their heads. People who were healthy all of a sudden became unhealthy and were sick and needed to try and recover. And so it's very important for us to understand that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has the power to change our fortunes in the drop of a hat. And this is a very humbling thing. Never to get too high, never to get too low. But when you are on the low, to understand that you can get back to the highest of highs with the help of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Adonai memitum hayem morid sheol v'ya'al. God puts people to death and then resurrects them. He brings them down to Sheol and then he brings them back up. God makes them lower, he makes them higher. Everything is a roller coaster ride from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so from the tefillah of Hannah and the story of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, the way he looked at tragedy and devastation was with a positive outlook, which was looking at what the potential could be for the Jewish people. And it's certainly my feeling that that's what the poet is bringing out over here. The reason why he speaks so much about the glory days of the Exodus from Egypt is not to pour salt into an open wound and think to ourselves, we can never get back there. Quite the opposite. It's to provide a hope for us that while we are sitting on the floor and while we are fasting and while we are recognizing the destruction that we experienced all those years ago that has yet to be fully restored, we look to the future with a positive eye. And for us today, we can even experience this more because we see the fruits of our labor. We see the progress of redemption happening before our eyes. We know the great things that could be there. We think about the Exodus from Egypt and the glory days of old. And Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and Hannah and the poet all tell us that this burns inside of us. It's alive. Notice the whole poem is in the first person. We experienced Egypt. We also experienced Yerushalayim. And just like we experienced the devastation, we also experienced the greatness, and we know we can experience that greatness again. So it is my humble beracha, and I leave you with the thought that while we bring the day of Tish'a BeAb to an end and we feel the gut-wrenching sadness, never lose faith and never lose hope in the great things that await us as a nation and as a people. If we're part of it, if we do it, Tzono Shel Makom, there are great things lying in our future, just like Betzeti Mitzrayim. I'll close with the words of the end of the poem, which I think really tell the story better than anything else that I could say. We say, El Elohet Tzevaot Yar'enu Niflaot. Let the Lord of hosts, which was Hannah's terminology, she coined that name for Hashem, the Lord of hosts who creates legions and has the power to do anything, Yar'enu Niflaot. Let him show us these great wonders, Ketzeti Mitzrayim, just like we experienced when we left Egypt, which we know we can do. V'yashav Shechinato El Tzion, and he should return his divine presence to the city of Yerushalayim. Va'avodato, and his service in the Bet HaMikdash, El Toch Yerushalayim, to the heart of Jerusalem and the Jewish people. Thank you so much for listening. Tizkeh Lerot B'Nehamat Zion.